Just to throw out a few statistics of what's going on in America, I don't know if you guys are aware, but did you know that the United States is currently the second largest unchurched nation in the world, with over 100 million people who don't go to church or doesn't have a relationship with Jesus? Do you know that North America is the only continent in the world where the church is not growing, and every other continent where the church is actually growing? In fact, 80% of churches in America currently are plateaued or declining, with thousands of them closing every year. So here's the question: why is that taking place? Especially in a nation where Christianity has been around, it's an open nation, we aren't persecuting, the government isn't shutting down churches yet. Why is it not growing when places around the world are booming, even though the government is hostile towards Christianity? I can give you one of the reasons. There's a multitude of reasons if you really want to look into it, but here's one of the reasons why that the churches here, particularly, are no longer growing. It's because people no longer come to church to find a community where they can contribute, but they come to church with the mindset of what can I receive from that church. In other words, they look at the church as a service of, let me check out the hamburger at this restaurant. I don't like it, I'll go to the hamburger at this restaurant. Or some people choose church like a buffet line. I like the teaching here, but I like the music over here, and I like the fellowship over there, so I'm just going to have a pick-me platter of all the different churches put together and make it to my liking. And what happens is that when you start to look at church with the consumer mindset of how everything must fit your need and everything must fit your preference, then you start to lose one of the original purposes of why the church began at all. And that one reason, as we're going to see in today, is that God built the church in general as a community of people to walk together and to live out a mission that King Jesus gave to them. And when you drift from that original mission, you should not be surprised when God no longer blesses the churches with continuous growth. And so that's what's really taking place. And so with that, if you ever end up taking a membership class here at Bethany, I'll go over 4 pillars. And this is, if you will notice, is what I'm going through with these different sermon series. The 4 pillars are witness, worship, which is 2 pillars we just talked about, walk, and then later on it's going to be work. And so today and the next few weeks, I'm going to be talking about what does it mean biblically to walk in community? What does it mean to actually live out the calling we have as a church? Because many people attend a church building on Sunday mornings, but they're not really walking in community if you actually compare it to what the original purpose of the church was. And so with that, let's look at Acts chapter 2, verses 42 to 47. This passage gives us a picture of how the first church began. Now, you guys know the story, but just a quick recap of what led up to this point. There's this really interesting Jewish carpenter who lived over 2,000 years ago. He had a teenage mom and adoptive father, grew up in a blue-collar lifestyle, wasn't very rich, wasn't part of the elite. He grew up in a home about the size of a parking stall with some animals in there probably. Very, very modest means. In fact, his parents were so poor that when they went to sacrifice animals at the temple, they had to choose the one left for people in poverty. And this person, for 30 years, this man worked as a carpenter. Not an impressive job, a blue-collar worker. He worked as a carpenter, learning from his adopted dad how to provide for his mom and siblings. And then all of a sudden, this man with no wife, no kids, no job, no prestige, makes a statement in Matthew chapter 16, verse 18. He tells a group of people who are following him, and he says to them, I will build my church. And the word church literally means a community of people with a common purpose. And he's saying, I'm going to build my community. And if you notice there, he says not a church, he says my church, which is a terms of ownership. This is my community. And he says, not only will I build my community, but he says, the gates of hell shall not prevail against them, meaning the defensive gates of hell cannot stop this community from charging in and breaking open hell and rescuing prisoners from it. This is coming from an unemployed single man with no wife, no kids, no job, with just a handful of followers. Imagine a 30-year-old, unemployed, homeless, single, grew up in a rural town, talking to 12 guys, saying this. So, As his disciples, you might be thinking, okay, good dream, but look around us. We don't have a big community. In fact, if there's Twitter back then, people would have been circulating what this guy said. This guy is crazy. He's saying he's going to build this big community that's going to overtake hell. Who is this guy? This guy's crazy. He doesn't know anything. He's out of touch with reality. And yet what we see is through this man's death and eventually, more importantly, his resurrection, we are here over 2,000 years later, millions, if not billions of people who claim the name of this man as their king. And we see the community that Jesus predicted gathering every week, proclaiming this message and changing the world and turning it upside down. And so what we see now is, how did this all begin? How did we get from where Jesus made that statement to where we are today? It is what happened here in Acts chapter 2. After Jesus taught for 40 days, after he resurrected, he ascended back to heaven, telling his disciples everything he wanted them to teach these next group of followers or disciples. And he tells them that when they receive the Holy Spirit and get empowered by the presence of God in them, then they could begin this whole new thing that he calls the church. And so in verse 41, we see that Peter gives a sermon and 3,000 people respond in that one day. Now they have to figure out, what are we going to do with 3,000 people all of a sudden? What are we going to do with people who come from all different nations? Because this is during Pentecost, where people are coming from all over the Roman Empire. What do you do when you are starting with 120 people and now you have over 3,000? So that's the context here. And this is what happens. And this is where we see the structure of what it means to walk in community as a church. And walking in community in verse 42, the first thing we see here is that it means that you share your life with other people. I want you to notice a key word in verse 42 where it says fellowship. Can you go to the next slide? The Greek word used for fellowship is something the Apostle Paul often uses. And only time that Luke, the author of Acts, uses this word comes up here, fellowship. Now, the word fellowship is not hanging out, having donuts and coffee after service. It's a lot more than that. Fellowship literally means to share one's life with another person. It is to mix your life with another person. That's a picture of fellowship. And so what we see is that people were starting to do that in verse 45. They are sharing in their possessions. Some people who had a lot of possessions were selling it, using that money to help those who didn't have much. And so it's not just hanging out with people who look like you, think like you, vote like you, talk like you. It's to share your life with people who are very different from you. Because the beginning community of this church was a multinational community, if you read earlier in the passage. It wasn't just Jews. These were Jews spread all over different nations initially. It wasn't just Jews. And later on, we see Gentiles join this community. And then other people, with different cultural thinking, different backgrounds, all sorts of things. And we see here that they were sharing life with one another. That is what fellowship is. Now, let's look specifically how they share their lives with one another. We see it in two ways. First, we see it in their sharing their private life with one another in verse 42. It says that they were breaking bread with people in prayer. Breaking bread refers to having a meal with a person. Now, having a meal in that culture at that time was a huge deal. Because having a meal is not just finding a person to eat with because you're lonely. Having a meal signifies to the public that you completely accept this person as one of you, as part of your community. This is why rabbis didn't have meals with prostitutes, tax collectors, Gentiles, even women. They would not have meals with women in public because they had to signify, I don't accept them as equals here. So when Jesus starts having meals with all those types of people, this is why he angered all the rabbis. Well, you understand as a rabbi where you are in society, why are you eating meals with people down here? And so what we see in the beginning of this church is people disregarded their previous hierarchy that exists in that culture. It didn't matter if you're on top of the food chain or bottom of the food chain, or you're part of the chosen nation, or you're not part of the chosen nation, or you're wealthy or not wealthy. All the early Christians got together and they accepted one another fully. They had meals with one another. They're telling the rest of the world, you might divide people in a certain way, but in this community, we don't divide people. We don't divide people by where they live. We don't divide people by how they look. We don't divide people by the color of their skin. We don't divide people by how they vote. We don't divide people by their net worth. In this community, we follow a different program. This is King Jesus' program. And if he accepts every single person, I accept every single person. So I'm going to have a meal with them. This is a very countercultural thing that's going on in Acts chapter 2. In our times, it might not seem that shocking. That time, that's a big deal that Jews are having meals with Gentiles, that respected people are having meals with people who aren't as respected. As later on, as we see in the book of Ephesians and Galatians, I mean, you're talking about people who are slaves and people are masters having meals with one another. You're talking about Jews and Gentiles, men and women. All sorts of barriers that exist at this time were being broken because of Jesus. Back in verse 9 in Acts chapter 2, you get a sense of the people that Peter was talking to who then started having meals with one another. These are people from Mesopotamia, Cappadocia, Asia, Egypt, Libya, and Africa. In other words, we see their ethnic differences. Then later on in Acts chapter 10, we see Gentiles become part of this community called the church. So not only are there ethnic differences, there's religious differences. Not everybody grew up with the Jewish law now at this point when you form the church, Jews and Gentiles. And we see social differences, slaves and masters coming together. And so what we see is private lives are starting to mix with one another. People who would never have hung out with this person in that Greco-Roman world are having meals with one another. But here's the second thing. Not only were they sharing their private lives, they were sharing their public lives with one another. I want you to notice in verse 46, it says that they worshiped together at the temple every day. Now, why were they going to the temple? Well, the temple was the public place of worship for the Jewish people at the time. And they weren't going there to remain Jewish. They were going there to actually proselytize and share the gospel with the Jewish people to invite them into this new community. And so they're publicly going and saying, you know, this whole Jewish system that you're a part of, well, guess what? Your Messiah has come. He started a new system. You can join that system by coming into our homes. So they're going out, sharing the gospel. And this is what fellowship was, both privately and publicly. There wasn't this divide between private and public life of keep your beliefs to yourself, just don't say anything in public. None of the Christians would have followed that. Not only were they privately having meals with people different than them, they're appealing publicly to people different than them to join this new community called the church and to join them in the mission that Jesus gave to them in Matthew chapter 28. So here's the question. How were people who are so different able to share their lives this way? And here's why. Because if you have Jesus in common, then you have everything in common that you need with another person. But if you don't have Jesus in common, I don't care how similar you are with that other person. You have nothing else in common in reality. Because here's the thing. If Jesus is the most important person to you in the world, if that other person also says Jesus is the most important person in the world to them, that's all you need. But even if I found another Korean American that loves the Lakers, loves the Dodgers, grew up in the same area code as me, eats the same food as me, and grew up with similar parents, if they don't love the most important person in the world, to me, what do we really have in common at that point? Can you imagine if a friend of yours says, you know what, I love you, but I hate your wife, or I hate your husband. I want nothing to do with your spouse, but you and me, we can hang out, right? There's no fellowship there. Because no matter how much you have in common with people, if you don't have Jesus in common, you don't have anything in common. That's the problem we have as Christians today. We focus on all these other things of having in common. We got to be in common with all these other things. If Jesus is not in the center of that, what are you trying to appeal to? No wonder churches is so superficial in what we talk about. Because we're not centered on Jesus. We're centered on common interests, common stage in life, common things, background, culture, ethnicity, nationality, without realizing Jesus is the one who brings people together. And you have to ask yourself, if you cannot find anything in common and you cannot fellowship with another believer, then ask yourself, where does Jesus place in your value system then? Maybe Jesus isn't the most important person in your life. Maybe he's the most important person on Sunday and not Monday through Saturday. That makes sense why you don't find a lot of fellowship with other believers. But if both of you are saying Jesus is the center of our lives, well, it's easy to bring that together, even with all the differences and the history and all the wars that happen amongst each other. You can still have more in common because you have the most important person in common. Isn't this how you explain world history? How nations that used to hate each other, Christians from those nations could come together and form a church? How do you do that? How do you overcome generations of war and death and genocide, and yet you see Christians coming together because they have Jesus in common with one another? You know, walking in community is a lot like being in a group of porcupines. Now, if you don't know how porcupines function, Porcupines, when they're in a weather where the ground is frozen and is being cold, what happens is that they have to get closer to each other to survive on body heat. But you know what happens when you get closer to quills? It starts poking you, right? And so a porcupine has a choice. Either they get close to the other porcupines, even at the cost of being hurt by the quills, or they can be on their own. But guess what happened to the porcupine that never got in close and stayed on their own? The next morning, they were all dead and frozen by themselves. And the ones who were willing to get poked and prodded and even bled stayed warm and survived. That's what community and church is about. You can try this whole thing by yourself, listen to sermons online by yourself, and just don't interact with other Christians and say, I don't need other Christians, I just need Jesus. But you're going to be like a porcupine by yourself. And life trials are going to come. That winter storm is going to come. And when you don't have other people, you're not going to make it. You're not going to make it. In fact, Jesus didn't create you to be alone. What was the one thing that was lacking in Adam, even living in a perfect world? He was alone. That was the one thing lacking. Man is not meant to be alone. You're meant to be in a community, whether it's your family community, your church community, or even your nation community. We are all tribal, communal people. And so here what we understand is that you have to be willing to push past the pain of other people who might be very different from you, who might even annoy you, who you might even get mad at. But because you have Jesus in common, you push past that and said, we need each other to survive in this life. And that's how the church started to survive in Acts chapter 2. They leaned into one another even though they were very different from one another. I don't know if you guys have ever visited the redwood trees in California. They're one of the largest trees, that you'll probably ever see. They're magnificent and beautiful, over 300 feet high. Many of them are over a couple thousand years old. Now, when you look at these trees, you might assume that because they're so tall, they must have a really deep root system, because usually the height of the tree is determined by the depth of the roots. But that's not the case for redwood trees. Their roots are actually really shallow. So you might be wondering, how did these trees survive for hundreds and thousands of years, even though they had a shallow root system? It's because all the trees' roots actually get intertwined with one another to the point where you can't even determine where one root begins and another root ends. It's just one big root that connects all the trees, so they share all the resources and then all the nutrients go with one another. The redwood trees need one another, in other words, to survive. And so does a Christian. You have to walk in community because you cannot survive on your own. God didn't create you to be on your own or to be a passive bystander that comes once in a while to a building on Sunday morning and that's it. No, He wants you to actually share your life both privately and publicly with other people who are on the same mission as you. And that mission is Jesus. As long as you have Jesus in common, you have all that you need to be in common. What we see next is not just that they shared their lives with one another, but walking in community means they also shared their resources with one another. I want you to look at verses 44 to 45. And it says, and all who believed were together and had all things in common. And they were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing the proceeds to all as any had need. The first thing I want you to notice is that when you walk in community, that requires that you have to be practical. It wasn't just, I'll pray for people who are suffering. They made practical steps to do that because they understood the term fellowship. If I'm sharing my life with another person and that person is hurting, well, that person who's hurting should mean I should feel the hurt as well. If my arm is broken, the rest of the body should feel that pain as well because we are one body. And so what they did is that they started to sell their possessions, those who had more, and they used that money to help those who didn't have as much. Now, there's something in the Bible that we start to see is that loving your neighbor is actually a practical command. It's not just a sentiment. It's not an emotion. Hey, love your neighbor. It doesn't mean just have positive feelings towards a person. In fact, the half-brother of Jesus said it like this. It's not enough just to say, I'm going to pray for you, because that means your faith is not really alive. Did you know that? In James chapter 2, verses 15 through 17, James says, if a brother or sister is poorly clothed and lacking in daily food, and one of you says to them, go in peace, be warmed and filled, without giving them the things needed for the body, what good is that? So also, faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. Another way of saying, what good is your faith if it cannot feed a hungry person? I'll pray for you. God be with you. You know what God will say to you? You are the instrument I'm going to use to be with them. You know that raise you recently got? It's not for you to get that 5th car. Maybe that person needs a little bit more than you do. Have you ever thought about that? Because guess what? Your money's not your money. Your money's given to you as a loan from the Creator. And when you stop using His money to love His children, you're going to have to be accounted for that at some point. Can you imagine if I left for like a trip for a year, let's say I went abroad, and I set up a money fund to a babysitter to take care of my 2 sons. And I gave them all this money, said, this is all the money that you're going to need to feed my sons and clothe them, make sure that everything's okay. And they're like, got it. And I came back after a year, and this person has a brand new Tesla. In fact, they had 2 of them, the self-driving Tesla. And my sons are lost all their way, skins and bones and no thing. Don't you think I will have a problem with that? Because although they controlled the money and managed the money, that money was not for them. Some of us forget whose money this is. And some of us have to remember whose is it for. And what the early church understood is that sharing your life was practical. It actually meant sharing your resources to help those who needed it. Not only was it practical, but it was sacrificial. In fact, if you go back to the Old Testament, God commanded Israel to sacrifice their personal profits to meet the needs of the poor. Do you guys know that? So the landowners, for example, couldn't just take all the harvest for themselves. They were commanded to leave the margins so that why? The poor and the foreigners, when they come through the land, can glean and have some food for them. In other words, don't let people starve around you. Instead of taking 100% of your profit, just take 80% and leave the rest for other people. In Deuteronomy chapter 15, verse 4, God commanded His people to meet the needs of the poor around them. In other words, God always expected His people to sacrifice some personal profits in order to meet the needs of those around them. Now, can you imagine if the church around America actually started to do this? Instead of maximizing personal profits, we said, you know what? I'll leave some on the table so that other people can survive. Would we get a bad reputation if all the churches did that? I don't care if you're an atheist that hates God. You cannot deny generosity at some point. You know what? That church is just so generous. They keep feeding me when I couldn't eat. Oh, I hate their God. I never heard that before. You wonder if we start to do some of these things that actually God already laid out. A lot of things will actually change in the church today. Just a thought. And so what you see here is that the early Christians practically and sacrificially were saying, I trust in God more than my money, so if I have some money that I can sacrifice and give to other people, I will do it gladly. I want you to keep in mind the crazy picture that I just explained to you in Acts chapter 2. None of this was forced by the government. A lot of times people read this and they think, is this a communism thing? It's like, this is not communism. Because what communism is the government saying all of yours is mine and I determine how I distribute it. This was voluntary. This is Christian community where they said all of mine is yours voluntarily and I'll give it to you. They didn't have to be taxed or forced to give some of their money to the poor. All of them just sold their properties and possessions, says, I'm going to do whatever it takes to help those around me who are poor. Isn't that shocking? Can you imagine Christians, if all the Christians had that mindset today? I'll sell my second property. You know what? Why do I need a second property? Let me help all those who are starving here in Skid Row. Why do I need that extra car I barely touch? Why do I have to go to Paris, France? Let's go to Paris, Texas, and let's just save the difference, and let's give some money to people who are poor, people who need it, right? Can you imagine if the church around the world just solved world hunger? Why are we waiting for the government to solve that problem? We can solve that. What if we wiped out infant diseases? What if we wiped out malaria in Africa? What kind of testimony would that leave behind? I know this is really hard to believe because sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction. Have you guys ever seen the movie Titanic? Okay, spoiler alert, this is like 30 years later, so if you get mad at me, that's your fault for not watching the movie. But if you read a little history book, you know what happened in Titanic, right? It was the biggest ship at the time that was ever built, and all the wealthy people went on this boat, going on this nice cruise somewhere, and then all of a sudden, iceberg, they didn't move in time, boom, right, it sunk. Now here's something that's interesting I learned from a director's commentary. In the movie, what you see is that there are some of these men who are jumping on the ship, trying to save themselves, pushing the women and children behind, because it was all chaos, every man for themselves, but that's not what happened in history. all the men, even the wealthiest men in the world at that time that was on that ship, chose to stay behind and let women and children go first and to give up their lives. Only 20% of the men on the boat survived. However, when they were making the movie, they said Americans would not believe this truth. So they added in this, men were trying to fight to get on the ship. But in reality, men had the sense of duty to let their lives be secondary to women and children. And they stood and let them go first, and only 20% survived afterwards. Sometimes truth is stranger than fiction. And I think when you read this passage in Acts chapter 2, we try to excuse it away. Oh, that's for them. These are crazy Christians who is doing that. This is not crazy Christians. I don't see any of the term, these are only crazy Christians doing this. It was every believer was doing this. Oh, only pastors were doing it. Only the apostles were doing it. No, every believer saw their possession as not theirs, but ours. This is the way the Apostle Paul says it to a group of poor Christians in Macedonia in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 1 through 5. He says, we want you to know, brothers, about the grace of God that has been given among the churches of Macedonia. For in a severe test of affliction, their abundance of joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in the wealth of generosity on their part. For they gave according to their means, as I can testify, and beyond their means, of their own accord, begging us earnestly for the favor of taking part in the relief of the saints. And this, not as we expected, but they gave themselves first to the Lord and then by the will of God to us. This wasn't rich Christians. These were very poor Christians living in poverty who wanted to give more to Paul. Because he was collecting an offering for the widows in Jerusalem. He's like, let me give you more. He's like, you don't have any more to give. I don't care. I'll figure out a way. Take more, take more, take more. That's what the picture was going on. And the Apostle Paul gives us a reason why they were able to do that. It says that they gave themselves first to the Lord. When you give yourself first to God, it's easy to give your resources to others. And if you have a hard time giving your resources to others, maybe you haven't given yourself first to God. This is not just commandments for the rich. Even the poor, everybody with means were giving because they gave themselves first to the Lord. They trust God and not money. But it's not just the poor Christians. Let's look at what Paul said to the rich Christians in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 17 through 19. As for the rich in this present age, charge them not to be haughty or arrogant, nor to set their hopes on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who richly provides us with everything to enjoy. They are to do good, to be rich, how? In good works, to be generous and ready to share, thus storing up treasure for themselves as a good foundation for the future, so that they may take hold of that which is truly life. Do you notice what he says to rich Christians? I want them to be rich in good works. Because by doing so, when they trust God and let go of their wealth for other people, they understand life at that point. How many rich people are miserable in life today? And maybe it's because they let money have a tight grip on their hearts instead of letting God have a grip on their heart. For many of us, if we're honest, money has a very tight grip on our hearts and our minds. We wake up and the thoughts are all revolving around money. Can I afford that? What about the next paycheck? Can I retire at this point? What about this? Money drives all of our decisions. And you have to ask ourselves, is that what life is all about, according to Paul and Jesus? In fact, the Apostle Paul tells us Jesus in Acts chapter 20, verse 35, taught him this, where he says, it is more blessed to give than to receive. Some of us heard that phrase, and we all say, yeah, I agree, it's more blessed to give than to receive. Do you really believe that? Then show me your checkbook. Let me see. If you really want to know what is gripping your heart, they say, look at two things. Look at your calendar and look at your bank accounts. Because where you spend your time and money, that's where your treasure is as well. So this is not to tell you what's the percentage. I don't know what the percentage is. God will convict you of that. But at the end of the day, ask yourselves, what is controlling the desires of your heart? Are you walking in community practically and sacrificially, not just in good words and prayers, but you're actually doing the things God wants you to do? And so walking community means to share your life, share your soul, share your resources with one another. But here's the final point. Walking in community will only work if you are willing to be vulnerable. In our sinful natures, here's the thing I notice, I think all of us have. We all know in our heads that we should be drawing close to the believers around us in this community, and we should be intertwining our hearts with theirs. We know that. But there's a reason. Maybe it's from past experience, maybe from past hurts, maybe it's from a previous church where things were chaotic. We keep a distance a little bit. And the reason why is that we're afraid of being vulnerable with people around us. Because if you've ever been vulnerable, you know there's a risk attached to being vulnerable. If you actually shared the flaws, the sin struggles in your life, and the problems you dealt with, you know what? Not everyone are good faith actors. There might be some people who use that to weaponize it against you. There might be people who gossip about you and tell everybody around about your business. This is why I say, just share everything you have to have, then you have nothing to gossip to me about, right? So I just tell you all my flaws. You already knew. I mean, I have many more stories to go, so you'll hear more. But if you really want true community, you have to put away those facades that we all put up. That this cleaned up version is like, oh, how are you doing? Oh, everything's perfect. I got everything under control. Really? Then why are you here then? Why do you even need God if you have everything under control? You see, being vulnerable is a necessary ingredient for community to actually happen. But we also understand you have to be willing to take that risk. Because sometimes you may get hurt when you are vulnerable. But that's a risk you must choose to pay each time. And so the main barrier to true community is the fear of being vulnerable. And here, I want to be honest. I think some of you have legitimate reasons why you're afraid of being vulnerable. Because you've tried it before. Maybe at another church, or maybe even at this church previously, and it didn't work out well for you. Maybe there have been people who hurt you maliciously and purposely and gossip about you and your family when you're going through a time of trial. Instead of people actually helping you when you needed it, they just judged you from a distance. And there are many young believers I hear this story from, very common, where they grew up and that was the case, and they want an arm's distance from the church. And so I'm not going to be naive to say, hey, just be vulnerable. It's going to turn out great all the time. It might not turn out great. But let me ask you a question. What's the alternative? Here's a quote from C.S. Lewis that perfectly sums up why we have to be willing to be vulnerable to experience true love. He says, to love at all is to be vulnerable. Love anything and your heart will certainly be wrung and possibly broken. If you want to make sure of keeping it intact, you must give your heart to no one, not even an animal. Wrap it carefully around with hobbies and little luxuries. Lock it up safe in the casket and coffin of your selfishness. But in that casket, safe, dark, motionless, airless, it will change. It will not be broken. It will become unbreakable, impenetrable, and irredeemable. The only place outside of heaven where you will be perfectly safe from all the dangers of love is hell. And so I'm telling you, yes, there's a risk. If you are vulnerable here with the people around you, maybe some of them may not understand that. Maybe some of them might hurt you. In fact, I can guarantee we're all sinners here. We all have the same sin nature. Some people are probably going to hurt you and not going to understand you. But the alternative is lock it away. Keep everyone from a distance. Every church you go to, find something to nitpick so that you don't have to get involved with the people there. And what you do is you harden your heart to never be loved and to never willing to give love. And I don't think you want that alternative. Because at the end of your life, you will reap what you sow. And if you never loved people and invested in other people, there will not be many people there when it's time for you to leave this earth. You know, in Romania, there are a lot of orphans. There's like an epidemic of orphans there. And they actually don't have enough food or medical supplies or staff members to take care of all of them. And so what happens is a lot of these babies in Romania, even when they get to the toddler age, are still kept in diapers and cribs. And none of them, for maybe 2 to 3 years, have a single human contact because there's not enough workers or they have a lack of resources. And so they never experience being held or cuddled. And what happens is that a lot of these babies and toddlers end up in a semi-catatonic state called failure to thrive syndrome because they haven't been touched by another human being with love. You see, that's what happens when you're unwilling to be vulnerable with other people. Spiritually, you will be in the semi-catatonic state, where nothing will pierce you anymore. Your heart will be so hardened because you're so cynical because of the past pains of people. But what happens is that you just become so hardened and cynical, you can't even let the love of God in anymore at some point. Life is not about getting to the finish line by yourself. It was about walking together, even with flawed people, loving one another, because that's the way God intended. You know, years ago at the Seattle Special Olympics, as you guys know, the Winter Olympics is going on. There's also a thing called the Special Olympics. Well, back then in Seattle in the Special Olympics, there was 9 contestants that was lining up for the 100-yard dash. And then when the gun went and they started running, one person tripped. And this one person who tripped and he was on the ground and he actually started crying. And the other 8 saw that he tripped and started crying. And they went back to this person that tripped. They picked him up. And one girl with Down syndrome bent down and kissed him. And she said, "This will make it better." And she linked arms with him and the other 9 joined and they all walked to the finish line together. Deep down, all of us understands that picture is winning. More than the one person just ran across and looked behind and didn't care. We all know deep down, life is not about rushing to the finish line by yourself, making sure you end up with the biggest number of your bank account. No, life is about helping other people cross the finish line with you so that they can see King Jesus with you as well. Walking in community is that picture. Can you imagine if our church actually started living that way? Can you imagine if our church saw the people around us not as nuisance or as barriers or people to be afraid of, but we linked arms with them when they are hurting and say, "This will make it better. Follow me to King Jesus." Because Jesus understands your pain, even if I can't understand your pain. Jesus will love you to a degree even I can't love you. But in the meanwhile, I'm not going to guard my heart. I'm going to open myself up to you. This is what Jesus did for me. This is what Jesus can do for you. You can join our community. We are not going to judge you here, no matter what you're going through. We are not going to condemn you for the sins you're going through because I am just as sinful as you. We will accept you and love you because that is what our Savior did for us. Can you imagine if all of us did that with everybody around us? What if any person who comes to our doors is fully accepted and loved, where we share our private lives with them, our public lives with them? Even if they needed finances, hey, I can sell this and give that to them. Can you imagine if we all start to be a little more vulnerable with one another? Actually sharing when our week hasn't been that great. Actually sharing maybe, I don't even know if I want to do this whole Christianity thing now. Actually sharing that maybe you lost the most important person in your life, or you're watching a loved one deteriorate in front of your eyes. You don't have to put on a brave smile on Sundays as if that's the goal. The goal here is that God has provided a community of Jesus followers who will pick you up along the way. Because as they pick you up today, there may come a day where you may need to pick them up as well. That is what it means to walk in community. More than a sermon and some songs and listening to me yell, this is what it's about. More than just holding a campus and making sure we don't lose this campus, it's the picture of community. So let me ask you a final question. Who are you walking in community with? And are you willing to pay that cost, even at a risk to you, to love people because God has first loved you? Let's pray.